Welcome or welcome back, everyone, to the 2023 Leading Transformational Change Forum. My name is Ian Ziskin. I'm the president of EXec EXcel Group and also the co-founder and leader of the Consortium for Change, which, along with One Business World, are the hosts and sponsors of this forum. It's great to be able to spend time with you now in what turns out to be our final session of our three-day Leading Transformational Change Forum. I'm really excited to be able to introduce you to and spend time talking with Chris Kastner, who is the CEO of Huntington Ingalls Industries. First, a little bit about Chris and about Huntington Ingalls before we dive into the interactive conversation that we're going to be having together. Chris and I actually go back a number of years, I think somewhere between 15 and 20 years, when I was the chief HR officer for Northrop Grumman at the time. And Chris was actually one of our very highly regarded, high potential, up and coming leaders in the company, where we first got to know one another. And as you'll see, the time that's passed since, it turned out in identifying Chris as a high potential leader was quite accurate, because he's had a remarkable career. Chris, by history and background, mostly grew up as a finance and contracts kind of person. And what's been particularly remarkable to watch, Chris, about your career is with that very strong finance and contracts background. You've managed to parlay that into fairly recently moving from chief financial officer role to the chief operating officer role to the chief executive officer role now since March 2022 of Huntington Ingalls Industries. And we'll get into the conversation in a minute about that whole transformation and transition from role to role to role, and what that's all meant for you as a leader and as a person. First, before we do that, just a little bit of thumbnail sketch on Huntington Ingalls Industries, because I think it'll be relevant to the conversation that we're about to have. Huntington Ingalls is about $11 billion revenue company with about 44,000 employees, and plays in the defense industry, a wide array of arenas touching sea and land and air and cyberspace. Happens to be the largest military shipbuilder in the United States, and very complex, very large, as you can imagine, given the statistics that I've just shared. Very heavy emphasis on engineering and manufacturing, which makes it all the more remarkable, Chris, I would say, that you've ascended to the CEO role coming out of a finance background rather than the engineering and manufacturing kind of background that might be a little bit more traditional. It is definitely an honor and my pleasure to have you here for this conversation today. So thanks a million for joining us.
Thanks, Ian. I really appreciate it. Always look forward to these sort of discussions, and we've been working together for a while. You've been very helpful in my career, especially over the last 4 or 5 years. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that. Thanks for the acknowledgement as well. Now, maybe if we could, the whole 3-day experience that we've been through on leading transformational change, as you know, you might expect, has all in many ways been about people at the individual level or the team level or the organizational level or even the societal level dealing with large, complex change. And I'm a firm believer that it always starts with the individual. So if you think about it from your perspective and look back maybe over the course of life and career, you've been through a number of transitions yourself. I'm wondering if you could think a little bit about 2 or 3 key inflection points over the course of life and career that perhaps have made the biggest difference to you and your thinking about, you know, what it takes to be a successful leader and a successful leader of transformational change.
Yeah, that's obviously you gave me some of these questions beforehand, so I've been able to think about them a bit. But I harken back to my kind of the most influential mid-career sort of thing was I actually left my legacy company, Northrop Grumman, and worked for Gateway Computers during the dot-com era. And I quickly became, from the youngest person in management at Northrop Grumman, I was the oldest at Gateway Computers in a week, from a culture that was very established to a very not established culture, to a mission that was very clear, to a mission that was fragmented, and into a company that was very, very stable, into a company that was trying to go through some pretty significant change, but was having a very hard time doing it. So it really taught me about mission. It taught me about culture. It taught me about having a common identity that I was fortunate enough to have, and I always relied upon at my legacy company, and that I didn't have at Gateway. So that taught me that you can never leave, you can never lose, or never stop communicating that common mission, common culture, and it's even more important as you're going through radical change. Is you always have to draw back on, okay, what's the mission here? And Gateway did not do a really good job at that, failed at that. Gateway isn't even a company anymore. And I was fortunate enough I got to come back to Northrop Grumman, but it was very instructive for me as a mid-level manager to learn that lesson.
Just wondering, while you were mentioning Gateway, clearly there are big differences between aerospace and defense company like Northrop Grumman, or of course Huntington Ingalls that you now work at, versus a Gateway, technology, computer kind of organization. Right. Did you notice anything that was different about the culture or the people at Gateway compared to what you had experienced previously at Northrop Grumman? The reason I ask is because as we get deeper into the conversation, we're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of people and culture as relative aspects of leading transformational change. Any thoughts about that?
Well, fundamentally, Gateway, historically, when they were very successful, was a Midwest company that had a very firm and a solid culture and mission. It was we're gonna work hard. We're from the Midwest. We're gonna give you low cost, high performance computers that you can configure to your needs, and we'll ship it right to your door. My first computer was a Gateway, when I was in college. So what they actually, when I got hired, they went away from that. They kind of lost their way, right? So it's not as if they didn't have it. They had it initially, but they tried to transform themselves without understanding what their core fundamental belief system was and what their values were, and they just lost it, right? And you see what happened to them. And so when I conduct myself, we're going through some pretty significant change here at Huntington Ingalls right now, and even though we've been around 130 years, I need to always make sure that I draw back upon the mission and culture in order to ensure that we're successful. Because if you don't, the middle management and the senior management are not going to buy into the change that's required. They're not exclusive. You can have change while still having a solid foundation in values and a similar culture in the organization.
Right, for sure. And I'm make an assumption that the Gateway experience, but also a series of other experiences that you've had over your career have influenced you in some way, as you became CEO. So, March 2022, you're thrust into this position after a lot of preparation of becoming the CEO of Huntington Ingalls Industry. Pretty significant change, for you and the company as well. Was wondering from that point of view, much more visible role, obviously a big, complicated role. How has that changed you as a person, and also your views about leadership by moving into a job that's that big and complicated?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And we just had our board meeting a couple of days ago, and I'm fortunate that on my board I have an individual that was a CFO for 5 years, like I had been, and then the CEO for 5 years, and we're sitting next to each other. And another board member asked and said, "Well, so Chris, how do you like the job?" And I said, "Well, it's not that much different than the CFO job." And the guy next to me said, "You're lying." And I go, "Yeah, you're right. I'm lying. It is completely different than the CFO job, because you don't do anything. You have to keep your hands off and let your team go. The team has to execute, and that's a very challenging thing to do for people that have always become successful by executing. It's how you succeeded. It's how you did well in your career, and now you don't get to do it anymore. You have to rely on a great team to execute. So that is the biggest difference. Is that the CEO job? It's interesting that I know you're a rock and roll guy, Ian, but the words of that song, "Everybody's so different, I haven't changed," right? That's a phrase in a song, and I draw back on that. Is you feel like you're the same, but people treat you a little differently, and you need to be conscious of that because your effect on them is different as well. Even as a CFO, I didn't represent the corporation. I did it to some extent, but I didn't embody it. And so as a CEO, it's very important. Every person I see in the community as well as employees, it's very important that I live the values, that I'm consistent with the culture and the mission. And so it's a challenge, but it's an honor, actually.
Well, let's dive into that just a little bit more deeply, because you made a comment which I, on one level, completely relate to and agree with, about you don't really do anything, as the CEO, because you're relying on many other very competent people who work with and for you. But at the same time, you've got to make all kinds of decisions, big decisions and little decisions. And in particularly in a company like Huntington Ingalls, I mean, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, highly successful for 130 plus years. So obviously a lot has gone right and been done right, over those years. Yet you step in as the CEO and you're immediately faced with some big decisions about what do you preserve and protect, because they're fundamental to the organization's success and have been for a really long time. And also other things that no longer really can or should be preserved or protected. They somehow need to be changed or undone or redone because they might not be relevant anymore for the organization's needs now and where it's headed in the future. That's a lot of sorting out that you have to do as a CEO to figure out what to protect and what to change. So if you would, go into some detail, fair level of detail about some of the things that you identified that needed to be preserved and others that needed to be changed, and your thought process that was associated with, how you made those decisions.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We spun in 2011 from Northrop Grumman, but we're a 130-year-old company. The Newport News Shipbuilding started 130 years ago. So I was fortunate in that, and our mission is very clear, right? Supporting the United States Navy and the DoD with systems, ships, to protect our nation, right? The mission is very clear. And the culture had a very strong foundation. Our ethical culture and our values are very strong. So I needed to preserve that, and it was important I preserve that. But we were in the middle of reinventing ourselves by adding a $2.5 billion company that was heavily tech focused. So how do I preserve that mission and culture while having a 25% of my company being tech focused? So it changes your recruiting, it changes your brand, it changes your reach in the different markets that you're in. It goes from domestic to international. And we had to think through what are all the things that we needed to change in order to approach those markets and the talent that we needed within the organization, right? So we needed to recruit differently. So it helps to have a great comms team when you do this. And I would note it might need to be a comms team that isn't wedded to the legacy that you had, because they may not have the broadness of thought to approach the new sort of changed environment that you're going into. So we changed our brand, right? We changed our website. We changed the way we spoke about the company. We actually opened a new office in Washington, D.C., in Arlington. So every facet of the business, we had to think about, okay, now that we have this we're going through this change, how can we make that as successful as possible? And we implemented those initiatives over the first couple of years. So it was maintaining the legacy and the mission that we've always had, because that's very important to us, but then understanding what we needed to do to take advantage of this new business that we had, because the market dynamics were just simply different in that business.
Let's dive into that just a little bit deeper. So, for example, you mentioned the decision to set up an office in Washington, D.C. Your historical headquarters of the organization have been in Newport News, Virginia, and Southern Virginia. And you were sending a signal with the idea of establishing an operation, a foothold, if you will, in the Washington, D.C. area. Can you talk a little bit more about the signal you were trying to send both to customers and those external to the company, as well as to people inside of Huntington Ingalls?
Yeah, so we've always had a small presence in Washington, D.C., because we're so close to the Navy Yard up there. But we have new customers now, and it was important that we had an office closer to the Pentagon, and all of our peers that we compete against are up there as well, with the vast majority of their corporate offices. So while we haven't formally moved the corporate office up to Washington, D.C., I'm spending a lot more time up there, and a lot of my executive team is up there. I was sending a signal internally that this was important, that we're not just shipbuilding, that we're much broader than that, and having a place where customers and suppliers and our competitors knew that, hey, HII is different now. It's interesting too. This week we launched an ad campaign in the Pentagon, underneath the Pentagon, in the where the train comes in, right? So everything's HII right now, and it's interesting that we have some customers that have completely embraced it. Some don't know what it is at all. So the work never ends from a comms standpoint when you're trying to go through change and reinvent yourself.
On that point about the work never ends from a communications point of view, that also implies you doing some things differently as the leader of the organization in terms of what you're communicating, how you're communicating it, how often you might be communicating. Can you talk a little bit about the intentionality of the approach that you're trying to use with your team in playing the role of communicator of change?
Yeah, sure. So chief communicator has to be the CEO. You can't push this down to a staff to let them communicate the change. I meet with directors and middle management within the corporation every month, different lunches with leaders, different avenues where I can speak directly on the company. And I'm very intentional in what I talk about when I speak to these middle managers and directors in the organization, so that they fully understand the strategy and where we're going as a corporation, why we changed the brand, why we bought this $2.5 billion, why we've created this $2.5 billion technology company, just so they've heard it from me, so that they hear it from me once a month. We have high potential teams that come up to corporate and they hear it again from me then. So it's a very consistent pulse. All the communication on the website and through the internet is very consistent, that it's a very strategic communication about where we're going and how the company's changed and what our objectives are.
Can you also talk a little bit about the establishment of the technologies organization? Because in essence, I mean, that was a reorganization in terms of operating model, but it was also a change in strategy in terms of what you were going to focus on for the long term for the business. Can you say a bit more about what the thinking was from your perspective and the organization's perspective of why set up an organization like that?
Yeah, so we saw that, and there's always a debate about ships. There's a debate about aircraft carriers. At some point in the future, are we going to fight in space, right? Is it going to evolve so that ships aren't as relevant? We believe ships will stay relevant. We believe having that forward presence is a pretty good deterrence, but that wasn't enough. So we were paying attention to how industry was evolving and the priorities of the Pentagon and the commercial technologies that were being applied, stuff like live virtual constructive training, unmanned cars or unmanned ships, AI, ML, ISR on the edge, electronic warfare, all these things. We saw the priorities developing. We knew that they could enhance the capabilities of our platforms when they worked together, and we felt we needed to have a presence in that, or we could potentially be rendered not obsolete, but less effective and less relevant. So we incrementally acquired a few companies, putting our toes in the water to see if it made sense culturally, see if they were compatible with the organization, and it culminated in a $1.6 billion deal that we added to our billion-dollar business with the Alliant transaction that lined up perfectly with where the Pentagon was going. They've done a great job. They've grown at 7% year over year through the first 3 quarters, and they've done exactly what we want them to do. We as HII can get them into doors that they couldn't get into, right? And then we're using the technologies that they've developed on our ships and in our shipyards. So it's been it's been a wonderful transaction. It's created a lot of value for our shareholders, and I think the customers like it as well.
Yeah, I'm gonna ask you to say a little bit more about some changes that you might have made in dealing with customers and the external perspective in just one second. But before we get to that, I'll just remind our audience listening in, we'd like to welcome you into the conversation as well. So feel free to use the Q&A button on the screen to ask some questions. And as Chris and I continue the conversation, I'll come back to you and share some of those questions with him so he can answer those as well. Before we do that, though, Chris, if we could just dive a little bit more deeply into the customer external side of things, when you were thinking about what to preserve and what to change as you were stepping into the CEO role, is there anything that comes to mind related to customers that really became a focus of yours?
Yeah, so the biggest thing for us was to reassure our customers that we hadn't taken the focus off shipbuilding, that this was not a pivot away from shipbuilding, which has historically been our largest business, but this is really an initiative to enhance shipbuilding, to make shipbuilding more relevant. And so and if you know the Navy, there's a lot of different navies, and you need to continue to communicate that to different areas of the Navy so that they were comfortable. I'll tell you, the combatant commands, which are the people that do the work out in the regions of the world, they got it immediately, because we were going to bring additional capability to them. But you needed to preach that to the balance of your customer set so they understood it. And we're still doing it to this day.
Now, one other question related to the big picture change before we head a little bit more specifically into people and culture. In addition to the things that you've already mentioned, was there anything else that occurred to you, as you were in the job for the first maybe year or so, that maybe needed change, but you were concerned about the timing or the time phasing of it? You could see the need perhaps for that change to occur, but perhaps you also concluded it wasn't the right time to do it as soon as you were stepping into the CEO job. Anything come to mind in that regard?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Yes, I'm not sure. Let me put it more vaguely than specifically. When you're in duress, you have to be careful of changing too much, right? Especially with a prideful organization that's trying to do the best they can, you have to be careful that you damage the culture and damage their thought of their mission, and potentially being an outsider coming in. You need to be accepted as an insider into the organization, and not change too much and destroy the asset. And some parts of Lion, when we acquired them, were very successful, but maybe didn't have the same cultural footing that we had. So you needed to incrementally change that in order that they could continue to be successful, but made sure that they had the same values and mission that the corporation had. You couldn't edict something the day you bought a Lion and said everybody has to behave this way. It had to be an incremental. You had to show them that this was the right way to do things and that it mutually benefited all of us. So you had to be careful, and that's mostly integration of M&A, but it's very mindful in how you do that.
Yeah, you raised a really important point, which is even for the things that need to change or would eventually need to change, there's a time phasing and a prioritization of it because you can't do them all at once anyway. Do I have that right?
That's absolutely right.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Now, as we get into some of the specifics about the role of culture and people, a couple of important parts of the equation of large-scale transformational change, I want to ask you a couple of questions about that, but we actually have a first question from some of our participants, so I'm going to share that with you and ask you to address it. The first question has to do with skill gaps. What skill gaps did you actually find that you had to focus on to have more of a forward presence, a move toward the future kind of an orientation? How did you determine those, particularly as related to staying ahead of the curve in areas like manufacturing, engineering, and technology as you were starting to transition the business?
Yeah, so that was actually pretty easy. You find the people that are forward-looking fairly quickly, and some of which you won't have in your organization. We had to add people that were outside of the organization because at sometimes within an organization, they're too wedded to the legacy culture. They're too wedded to the legacy strategy, and they just, even though people you think and they say are willing to change and think that they are willing to change, they don't. And you have a pretty good way to figure that out just based on conversations with them and introducing things to them that you might wish they could consider doing, and they dismiss it out of hand. So you have to be, if you're gonna do not radical but pretty significant change within an organization, I firmly believe you need some outside help. And you need to see it. You need to bring people from outside the organization, because you're going to have to push the people that you're relying upon in the organization, because left to their own devices, you won't do it, right? And you can't do it yourself. So I brought a new comms person in who has really been pushing change, and she's doing a fabulous job. When I thought about hiring on my staff, I made sure that I hired people on my staff that, even though they had some footing in the legacy culture, I had known them that are people that are receptive and are willing to do incremental change. I brought a new strategy person into the organization, someone that's really been pushing the strategy. I brought a new chief technology person into the organization, and these are all people that are pushing change. They believe what we're doing, but they're also people that are very accepted within the organization. So it can't be change. It can't be an aggressive change where you're driving it down their throat, so to speak. It's going to have to be collaborative. This is why it's good for you. So there's a lot of judgment involved in that. A lot, and I'll repeat it. In your legacy organization, people will say they want to change. They will say that they're willing to change. They might even believe they're going to change, but the proof is in, do they? Right? So you got to test that very quickly. Are they really going to do something different? Because after they leave the room, they might just go back to their old legacy way of doing things. So that's why it's a consistent pulse It's a consistent communication, and you have to bring external help within the organization.
Well, and you also said something really, really important, I think, because it has to do with mindset, which is you use the term, wedded to, right? People are kind of wedded to, certain things that they won't let go of. One of the questions that we got from our participants, I think, ties directly to that. It happens to be somebody who's originally from Sioux City, Iowa, Gateway's former headquarters, as she describes it.
Yeah.
And she goes on to say, so sad that they went out of business. But given your experience, what advice would you have for other tech companies today, given what you learned from your Gateway experience, your Northrop Grumman experience, your Huntington Ingalls experience, which I think in some ways that question ties very much back to this point about, being wedded to certain things. And any insights about that?
Yeah, so I could talk for days about Gateway. I feel it was such a great company when it started. And what they did is they hired a bunch of external people to run it. They moved to San Diego, lost the core values and the mission and the strategy of the business, and they went out of business. Ted Wade is the guy who started Gateway's genius, was a great leader, but I think he had other visions and wanted to get out of the business and hired some people. So it's just that balance between maintaining the core, maintaining the culture and the mission, but then pushing the organization that you have to change in order to survive. And with Newport News, which is a 130-year-old business, they have a history of change. They have a history of evolution. In the 50s, there was a number of builders of large ships that were asked to go to the Midwest and learn about nuclear propulsion. But Newport News was the company that sent 5 nuclear engineers to develop the first nuclear aircraft carrier. So you have to continue to remind them that you've been alive for 130 years because you've evolved, right? So you have to evolve. We're not going to disrupt the mission of and the culture of the company, but you have to evolve or you're going to die.
Yeah, that's probably the most significant lesson of all. Yeah, thank you for that. We also have another question from one of our participants, which leads us really directly into this conversation about people and culture, where he says people are the biggest asset at Huntington Ingalls. I'm curious about initiatives that you're using in the company to retain and grow your talent in this highly competitive talent market.
Yeah, so people are the most important asset for sure. 45,000 employees, and it's a bit different. We've in our engineering and technical teams, we've made sure that we've given people not only pay. You have to deal with pay, but our technical is benefited by the leadership of our new CTO, who's really thought about from a community of practice. Technically, we need to make sure that there's a path for our technical team so that they're respected and honored, independent of becoming a vice president or a director in the organization. So we have a technical fellows program, which we think is going to be very successful and gives our young technical team a path towards, if they don't want to manage people, they just want to be the smartest person in the room. You can be the smartest person in the room, be very successful and respected within the organization. I'll tell you, retention from a craft personnel or the touch labor personnel has been a significant challenge. And the challenge for us is we have to meet the people as they're walking in the shipyard as they are. 20 years ago, they would walk in, they'd have skill, they were trained, they probably had shop class in high school, and it was easy to get them trained up and into the workforce. Now we have people that have never mowed their grass of their family house. They don't know how to read a ruler, and have never hammered a nail. And we laugh about that, but think about your kids. If you have kids, how often have they done that around your house? When I know I was growing up, my dad was always making me do that. So it's just a different environment, and they have alternatives because the employment rate is such. They can go work in the service industry or the warehouse industry for the same amount that they work in a very incredibly demanding job within the shipyard. So we have taken a very direct and personal approach to the new hires coming in the craft. We actually bring them into their crews and into the training center with the foreman. They're going to work, they go out in the shipyard. Used to be you train them and send them, and they'd be the new guy on the crew or new gal on the crew. They'd be the one that kind of got hazed and got all the bad work. Now we send them together so they have a community when they go into the shipyard, so that they know their supervisor, they know a couple of the people they're working with, and we hope, we're not sure, but we hope that's going to improve retention. We've made much more flexible work shifts for our craft labor, which is unheard of historically, because we have a union agreement, and we had to go to the union and negotiate this flexibility. And you think it's odd. We want to give your people more time off. Will you accept that? But if you've ever dealt with labor unions, anything you change is going to be something you have to bargain for. Now, we got it through fairly easily with a side letter, but it's just different in the manufacturing workforce now. It's a more direct, hands-on, daily experience to maintain the relationship with these people in order for them to stay, 12 to 18 months.
Right. Yeah. And, in the few minutes we have remaining, I want to make sure we build on what you just said on the talent side, but anything else come to mind in terms of talent practices or around the culture that you have found to be particularly important and that have made the biggest difference as you've continued to transition the business and transform the way the organization is being run?
Yeah, for us, we always position back to the mission and the values, right? It's kind of our bedrock. And then even with the technical talent, updating the brand, ensuring that we're bigger now than just shipbuilding. I don't say just shipbuilding to minimize it, but we're just much broader now. And if we can continue to, and I've said this a number of times already, it's kind of the foundational mission and values, and then the forward-leaning technology approach. If you can meld those together and then continue to communicate it on a very consistent basis, both digitally and coming out of my mouth when I see people every day, then you got a chance.
Now, if we could, let's maybe wrap this conversation up by focusing on some of the difficulties you've had to deal with, the obstacles or the resistance that you've had to overcome in implementing some of the big changes that we've talked about and many other significant changes that we haven't talked about today. What have some of those obstacles and areas of resistance been that you've had to deal with along the way?
Well, I'm not done yet. There's obstacles that remain that I'm continuing to encounter and try to overcome. It's just comfortable to go back to the way we've always done things. It's very comfortable, and people that you think would do this very well sometimes don't do it very well, and you continue to need to communicate with them on the benefits of this, the importance of this, and you're always making long-term decisions, and you have to remind them that the only way we survive is to evolve, and they need to be a part of that, and it needs to be bigger than what they think. People, it's so interesting. We're very slow in promoting people at HII and traditionally at the shipyards. And we just went through our organizational leadership review process, which I think you did at Northrop as well. And we had that same process. And you review someone who was, 45 years old that had been in the job for 7 years, and it was outstanding. And the question is, 7 years in the same job and they're 45 years old, what are you doing? They need to have something else. They need to continue to learn, continue to be challenged, continue to contribute. And they look like, well, everybody has to, it's at that stage, you have to have that job for 7 years before you get promoted. And it permeates the organization, right? And so you need to continue to fight it wherever you see it, because it shows up in places that you don't necessarily wouldn't expect it, right? So it's called that middle management part of the organization where it's just hard to make inroads into. That's real. So you need to that's why I have the monthly meetings with the directors and and the senior managers, because I know that they're the people that really do all the work. So it's just constant good work that you have to do to continue to preach your philosophy.
Chris, as we wrap things up, any one final nugget of wisdom that you want to share with people on something perhaps we didn't talk about, or underscore something that we did talk about?
No, I'll just go back to the way you started this, Ian, which is what the focus of this entire conference has been. It's the people, right? It's direct involvement with people, and it has to be continuous because an ad campaign, a marketing campaign, a new website doesn't necessarily do it. It's going to take top-down, consistent messaging and interaction with the people in order to affect the change.
Really appreciate it, Chris. Awesome having you here today. Thanks for making the time.